They did not arrive first with swords. They arrived with ledgers. A Roman official entered the village, enumerating men, lands, and harvests, cataloging everything. In silence. The tax followed, systemic, non-negotiable, not intended solely as punishment, but as a perpetual assessment of sovereignty. Every coin tendered was a daily affirmation of systemic compliance. Every delay, the perfect legal premise for the application of force. Rome did not need to garrison every street. It only needed to quantify your debt. Entire provinces were integrated without decisive battles. The imperial order advanced line by line on sheet after sheet of data. Power resided not just in the legions, but in the arithmetic that financed their deployment. And when the subject refused compliance, Rome would remind them that data points, when weaponized, necessitate a permanent alteration of the regime. In 2 minutes, you will understand that the greatest innovation of the Roman Empire was not the concrete they poured, nor the legions they deployed, but the meticulous, standardized mechanism they created to systematically extract, measure, and leverage the underlying economic capacity of millions of disparate subjects across vast, unstable geographies. This is not history. This is the pure, unfiltered anatomy of fiscal statecraft. Here at Macro Threshold, your intelligence frontline for analyzing systemic control, we strip away the romance of antiquity and look solely at the cold mechanics of power projection. The challenge, for any empire, ancient or modern, is fundamentally one of long-range capital deployment and maintenance. How do you keep 30 operational legions, hundreds of thousands of auxiliary forces, a massive civic bureaucracy, and a perpetually expanding infrastructure network, roads, aqueducts, public buildings, in a state of continuous readiness across distances that take weeks or months to traverse? The answer is predictable, non-negotiable cash flow. The Roman Imperial project was essentially a multi-century, continent-spanning debt issuance collateralized by future tribute. The tax was not merely revenue, it was the non-negotiable operational minimum required to underwrite the regime of stability, the Pax Romana, which, ironically, was the primary product Rome sold back to its conquered peoples. This structural requirement translates directly into your current reality. Think of your annual property taxes, the escalating cost of medical insurance premiums, or the inescapable monthly calculation of your mortgage interest or rent. These are systemic fees, paid not for physical protection from external threats, but as a premium for participation in the existing social and economic order. Failure to pay is not an economic inconvenience. It is a rapid shift from systemic compliance to systemic liability. This critical link between macro solvency and micro obligation, between the cost of maintaining the imperial boundary and the price of your loaf of bread, is the foundational insight we must analyze. The initial phase of Roman expansion, what we label Phase 1, establishment, relied on simple extraction, war indemnities, and lump sum tribute. But this is unsustainable. It depletes capital and incentivizes revolt. The genius of the mature empire lay in Phase 2, optimization and quantification. This phase introduced the crucial administrative mechanism, the regular census, and the cadastral survey. Rome did not just demand coin, it first sought actionable data. The census, conducted rigorously, was the ultimate precision weapon, quantifying the maximum extractive capacity of every single piece of registered land, tributum soli, and every productive head, capitatio. The goal was to establish a precise mathematical baseline for assessment that was perpetually renewable, allowing the imperial center to project its future cash flows with startling accuracy. Every village's productive capacity was mapped, categorized by soil quality, proximity to water, and number of working hands. This comprehensive data set allowed Rome to set the tribute not based on immediate need, but based on a conservative projection of what the province could yield without suffering economic collapse. This was structural engineering of the highest order, managing the friction points of extraction to maximize yield without fracturing the underlying asset base. This cadastral data became the essential metadata for imperial control, defining an individual's legal standing, economic capacity, and ultimate liability to the state. The level of detail achieved by these instruments dictated not just how much gold was sent to Rome, but also the specific quantity of grain, annona, required for the legions garrisoned hundreds of miles away, transforming logistical requirements into systemic administrative obligations for the provinces. The efficiency of the state thus became inextricably linked to the pain threshold of the subject population. Guarda isso, é aqui que a maioria erra. Most analysts fixate on the visible violence of the legions, missing the invisible violence of the ledger, the system that moves into Phase 3, leverage and maintenance. Once the quantitative baseline was established, the primary imperial strategy shifted from acquisition to compliance management. The regular tribute payment, remitted on time and in the correct standardized coin, acted as a constant check. Up to this point, we have meticulously detailed the extraction mechanism, the cold, clinical quantification of human capital and land by Rome's administrative apparatus, turning taxation into a systemic debt enforcement tool. We understood that the purpose of the census was not just to raise revenue, but to establish a non-negotiable legal basis for future intervention, perpetually holding the subject populace in a state of quantifiable obligation. The outcome of this process was structural failure for the periphery. Provinces bled dry, small farmers defaulting on their tributum soli, and land being abandoned or forcibly seized. Now comes the uncomfortable reality, the critical element that separates mere historical analysis from market insight. The inevitable consequence of structural collapse is not generalized poverty, but maximized leverage for those holding the liquidity waiting for the precise moment of state-engineered distress. This is where we discuss the dry powder. The capital didn't disappear into thin air. It simply changed hands, often at valuations reflecting immense duress. The destruction detailed in the preceding analysis was the deliberate engineering of asset liquidation. Dry powder, in the Roman context, was the massive reservoir of liquid capital held by the senatorial class, the imperial family, and the wealthy publicani, the tax farmers and financiers. These powerful entities possessed the foresight, political access, and deep pockets necessary to acquire assets precisely when the state's fiscal pressure forced those assets onto the market at fire sale prices. The small farmer, crushed by the combination of fixed tax demands and currency debasement, could not service their debt, and their land, the core productive asset, was seized by the Roman fiscus and immediately put up for auction. Who were the buyers? The insiders, leveraging their accumulated wealth to convert temporary provincial insolvency into permanent structural control. This movement created the latifundia, the enormous estates that displaced the productive smallholders across Italy and the provinces. This was not a passive economic transition. It was an active capitalization on state-induced structural adjustment. The state's necessity to fund its legions and administration created the initial pressure. The administrative system quantified the debt and established the legal premise for seizure. The powerful elites supplied the liquidity, the dry powder, to acquire those assets. The cycle is elegant in its cruelty. The state breaks the debtor, and the elite buy the collateral. The Roman financial architecture ensured that the failure of the periphery was a massive, non-dilative, generational opportunity for the core. The wealth concentration that resulted was simply the mirror image of the administrative leverage deployed by the census and the tax demands. They engineered the crisis, stood aside, and then swept up the assets. This is the fundamental clinical application of power, where liquidity acts as the weapon, and state fiscal policy provides the legal ammunition. You must recognize that market cycles, whether in the 1st century or the 21st, are not natural phenomena. They are outcomes dictated by the flow of state-backed leverage. Guarda isso. É aqui que a maioria erra. The mechanics of this asset transfer were institutionalized. When a provincial town defaulted on its collective tributum, the local magistrate was held personally liable. The subsequent seizure often involved the sale of public goods, or even the temporary servitude of its citizens, all under the legal veneer of collecting a quantified debt established years prior by the meticulous census data. This created a highly asymmetrical risk profile. The Roman elite risked nothing in this exchange, only waited for the optimal moment to deploy their millions in capital, while the provincial populace risked their entire livelihood. It wasn't about revenue maximization anymore, it was about asset transfer maximization. The entire administrative state, with its network of roads and aqueducts, its legions and bureaucracy, was effectively operating as a highly sophisticated multi-century debt collection agency, designed not to sustain growth universally, but to sustain the structural advantage of the center. The moment the leverage exceeded capacity, the system shifted instantly from growth facilitation to managed, controlled liquidation. Now we pivot to the truly insidious financial strategy inherent in imperial statecraft, the socialization of the prejuizo, the socialization of loss. As the system of extraction succeeded in transferring wealth from the provinces to the Roman core, it simultaneously hollowed out the productive capacity of the periphery. Land abandonment increased, the remaining population struggled, and the tax base shrank dramatically. However, the costs of the empire did not decrease. The legions still required pay, the roads still required maintenance, and the central administrative infrastructure remained enormous. The political necessity of maintaining the Pax Romana meant that the costs, the fixed operational expenses, could not simply vanish when the provincial revenue streams dried up. This is the crucial fiscal shift. Private profit generated by the dry powder asset acquisition resulted in public, socialized operating deficits. When the province could no longer afford to maintain the local hospital equivalent or repair the vital water infrastructure, that burden fell back onto the central fiscus. When local defense forces collapsed due to inadequate funding, the central government had to deploy more expensive permanent legions. The wealth accumulated by the few was now forcing the administrative state to take on the fiscal liabilities created by that very extraction. In modern terms, the central bank is forced to backstop the solvency crisis created by excessive leveraging and asset stripping on the periphery. The Roman solution to this structural deficit was twofold, both resulting in a socialized tax that hurt every remaining citizen, including the wealthy asset holders, albeit disproportionately. The first mechanism was the imposition of the annona, taxes paid in kind, demanding grain, oil, or livestock directly, bypassing the unreliable monetary system. This was highly inefficient but necessary to feed the legions, essentially taxing the remaining productivity directly. The second, and far more pervasive mechanism of loss socialization was the currency debasement. When the state needed more denarii to pay its massive operational bills, but the tax intake was insufficient, the simplest solution was to adulterate the coinage. Silver coins were systematically replaced with coins containing higher percentages of copper or bronze. The nominal value remained the same, but the intrinsic metallic value plummeted. By the reign of Nero and dramatically accelerating later, the Roman state was financing its structural deficit, the shortfall created by the provincial collapse, through inflation. This inflation was the ultimate socialized tax. Every citizen holding currency, from the small artisan to the legionary trying to save his pay, saw their purchasing power erode immediately. The loss was transferred from the solvency sheet of the state to the real wages and savings of the populace. Let us be clinical about this. The wealthy elite, having used their dry powder to acquire massive estates, real assets, were partially insulated from the hyperinflation caused by debasement. Their wealth was now held in land and production, which retained its real value. The common man, dependent on wages or savings denominated in the debased currency, absorbed the vast majority of the systemic loss. This degradation of the monetary discipline, this fiscal desperation, was a direct consequence of the administrative state's success in maximizing asset transfer through debt enforcement. They won the asset war, but lost the foundational trust necessary for a functional monetary system. The degradation of public services, roads not maintained, grain supplies becoming erratic, basic infrastructure decaying, was simply the visible manifestation of the socialized deficit. The elite profited, the public fiscus absorbed the debt, and the general populace paid for it through inflation and declining quality of life. The core thesis remains: structural instability is not a failure of the system. It is the designed precondition for maximal wealth transfer. The state provides the crisis. Liquidity provides the solution for the few. Guarde isso, é aqui que a maioria erra. The difference between a controlled economy and a collapsing one is simply the velocity of the socialized loss. The final element of this administrative strategy hinges on the fact that debt accumulation was never intended to be fully repaid by the provinces. It was a control mechanism. The accumulated quantified debt, documented meticulously through the census and cadastre, provided the perfect, non-emotional legal pretext for permanent intervention. If a regional king or governor proved troublesome, Rome did not need to invent a diplomatic incident. It simply quantified their outstanding fiscal obligations, declared them in systemic default, and proceeded to seize assets, restructure the local government, or annex the territory entirely, all under the unimpeachable legality of debt enforcement. Default was not a failure of financial management. It was a political act of non-compliance, justifying the highest levels of coercion. The ledger precedes the legion. This mechanism ensures that political autonomy is permanently tied to fiscal capacity, and where fiscal capacity is purposefully strained, political autonomy becomes immediately conditional. The empire was not held together solely by walls of shield and spear, but by the relentless, non-negotiable arithmetic of quantification and debt service. The Roman state, by linking individual identity and productive capacity to quantified fiscal obligations, provided the blueprint for every modern statecraft that followed. The power resided not just in who controlled the army, but who controlled the ledger detailing the obligations. That administrative legacy, the requirement that the state must first register your net worth and your locus before demanding allegiance, is the foundation of the modern fiscal state. We see this historical pattern repeating endlessly. When sovereigns or states become too leveraged, the system never defaults into chaos. It defaults into a meticulously managed liquidation that benefits the most liquid and connected actors, leaving the central fiscus, the public, to absorb the structural cleanup through inflation or diminished services. If this systematic structural engineering, where state policy intentionally triggers asset distress to facilitate wealth transfer, was the fundamental mechanism for maintaining control over territories spanning continents and centuries, we must ask what happens when those same leverage mechanics, those same fiscal pressures, are applied to sovereign nations today. We are talking about leveraging debt as a weapon of systemic transformation. If the imposition of high interest rates and demands for austerity broke entire nations in the modern era, if euros, a 20% as imposed during the Volcker shock, Economically crippled developing nations and forced massive structural adjustments benefiting external financial powers? What is the inevitable outcome now when global interest rates shift rapidly after years of 0% liquidity? If structural debt and financial coercion were powerful enough to permanently alter the course of ancient empires, we must examine the most sophisticated debt warfare mechanisms ever deployed in modern history. Specifically, the question is, if high interest rates and engineered fiscal crises broke countries before, what is happening now in the geopolitical landscape? Next time, on Macro Threshold, we turn the lens to the 20th century to decode a masterclass in financial statecraft, how the U.S. financially ruined the British Empire. The hidden bill of World War II.